When we consider the reports we have gotten, and President Trump has actually confirmed this himself, that he is at least considering a limited strike on Iran in order effectively to pressure them into agree to something on the nuclear deal, do you think that would be an effective strategy, or does it risk backfiring?
I'm deeply skeptical and think it indeed risks backfiring. One thing that I have not yet seen is a real explanation of what the objectives would be, either of the short-term strike or, frankly, the longer term. If the assumption is that the short term would push the Iranians back to the negotiating table and be willing to make concessions that they're not currently able to make, I think that that's probably not accurate. And so I think you really do risk Iran needing to retaliate in its mind immediately and setting off a cycle of escalation.
Well, when it comes to justification, it was interesting to hear from Scott Bessent over the weekend. The president has talked about the need for a nuclear deal. We've heard a lot of reporting around other elements, whether it's ballistic missiles or, in fact, regime change. But remember, he said 10 or 15 days was the timeline at the end of last week that he might be making a decision. Scott Bessent said on Fox over the weekend that the regime is probably a week away from having industrial-grade bomb-making material. That's a direct quote. Does that give us a better sense of what this administration's projecting?
I don't know that it does. I'm honestly a bit baffled.
Is that true?
By that assertion. President Trump said back in the summer after the initial strikes that the nuclear program had been obliterated. And so there is a wide swath between obliterated and being within a week away. There have been, and I certainly have not seen recent intelligence reports on this, but there have been various estimates over the years that have suggested that they are inching closer and closer to what we would call a breakout capacity. There is still a wide gap between the ability to enrich uranium at a weapons grade to a weapons grade point and the ability to actually deploy that in a bomb. And so when we say a week away, it certainly sounds startling. That doesn't mean that they're able to launch a nuclear strike within, say, a week or a month or even, say, 6 months. But again, I do think that probably the public and certainly the Congress deserve some answers about where this gap is between the obliteration that was described over the summer and this being used now as a justification for renewed conflict in the Middle East.
Well, and again, we get back to the notion of where that conflict will ultimately end us. Will we be talking about regime change in Iran? We actually were joined last week on Balance of Power by the former defense secretary in the first Trump administration, Mark Esper, who warned actually that if you want to see regime change in Iran, you may end up with potentially a worse result than you anticipate. This is what he told us.
And I think the experts would say that the odds are that the successor to the Khamenei regime is going to be a hardliner as equal to or greater than Khamenei. So it could be more likely than not somebody from the Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So those are the concerns, and that's why, I think if you were to step back and strategically think about this, what you want to do is prepare a much broader game plan.
So when we consider that notion, Rebecca, or Jen, and I saw you kind of nodding in agreement there, is regime change, pursuing it right now, advisable in your mind?
Every U.S. government and military gaming of this problem that has been done in recent years, to my knowledge, has led exactly to that result, that the IRGC would be the natural successor to a regime that has been changed. And that is almost certainly a worse outcome for the people of Iran than what we currently have. And so, again, I think until this administration can better identify, and perhaps they have behind closed doors, but better identify what the objectives are and what the day after planning for this looks like, I think going in with an attempt to remove the top level of the Iranian leadership without understanding what comes next and what that sets off as far as destabilization in a region that is really central to President Trump's economic objectives is ill-advised.
Do you buy this idea of a bloody nose strike unlocking some sort of a deal? And if not, I think you expressed some skepticism over this at the beginning of our conversation. What is the prolonged campaign that would follow? Because the next hammer to drop would be a lot bigger.
Absolutely. First of all, I think it is a miscalculation to assume that an initial strike would lead the Iranian regime to be in a position to make additional concessions. They are at a point of weakness, which again raises questions about why now. But they're really at a point of weakness. And so additional concessions beyond the degradation of their proxy groups that we've already seen, the degradation of the nuclear program that we've already seen, I think would be viewed as existential. And so I do think it's a miscalculation to assume that they have additional concessions to be able to make. So yes, then you get the question of what does a longer term campaign, either by design or in response to Iranian retaliation, then look like, and that gets very dicey. This is a massive country. This is not another Syria. This is a massive country with very deep bureaucratic structures, and so the idea of regime change there is just on a different level than what we've seen elsewhere in the region. And I, again, have not personally heard any explanation of how you would reconstruct a government. Does that involve long-term U.S. investment, for example? And I think that the assumption that the Iranian people would somehow rise up and kind of do the job for us is also probably wishful thinking.
So in our final moment here, Jen, as we consider the notion of Iranian retaliation, when we saw Iran retaliate back in June for the strikes on nuclear facilities, arguably it was a de-escalatory measure, right? Do you think they would make the same decision this time around?
I don't. Again, I go back to we are in what I would consider to be an existential moment for this regime. I think they've been very clear in their messaging that it would not be de-escalatory as it was in the summer. And so I think we would see attacks against our facilities in the region, against our allies and partners.
So the other Gulf states?
I think that would be a good assumption, yes.
We heard reporting from Axios, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, advising the president and top officials that a campaign against Iran could carry significant risks and bring a prolonged conflict. As Kayleigh said, we only have about a minute left here, or 30 seconds at this point. Does Donald Trump set himself up to learn a lesson of the limitations of airstrikes?
I certainly think so. If there were an easy kinetic answer to this problem, we would have taken it at some point over the last 20 years. Yes, I think this would be destabilizing, and I think that there are no easy answers here. So I think the U.S. would be in a position of not having an identified off-ramp to fall back on.